It had been months since I noticed something was off in my marriage. My wife, Jessica, had always been the epitome of loyalty and trust, or so I thought. But little things started to change. Late nights at work, unexplained phone calls, and a sudden distance between us. The signs were subtle, but over time, they became undeniable. My suspicion grew, but I never confronted her. Instead, I decided to gather more evidence, just in case. One weekend, I found myself with some free time. Jessica had planned a girls' night out with her best friend, Sarah. I was both relieved and curious, hoping to finally get some clarity on the situation. That night, I decided to follow them. I didn't want to accuse her without being certain. What I discovered was a nightmare. I parked a few blocks away from the restaurant they had gone to, making sure to stay out of sight. I watched as Jessica and Sarah walked in, laughing, with Jessica's arm draped over Sarah's shoulder in a way that seemed overly affectionate. I waited for what felt like hours, watching them through the restaurant window, trying to make sense of it all. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. At around 10 p.m., Sarah and Jessica walked out, and to my shock, Sarah kissed my wife on the lips. Not a simple peck, but a passionate kiss. My heart sank as I watched the betrayal unfold in front of my eyes. My wife, the woman I had loved for years, was not just hiding something. She was having an affair. But what made it worse was the fact that it was with her best friend, someone I considered a part of our inner circle. I couldn't just sit there. I followed them quietly as they made their way to Sarah's apartment. That's when I decided to act. I didn't want to confront Jessica immediately. I wanted her to think she had gotten away with it, to feel comfortable in her false reality. I left the car, sneaked inside the house, and began to prepare my revenge. Not one of anger, but of clever planning. The next day, I invited Sarah over under the pretense of a casual coffee meetup. She arrived, unaware of my growing suspicions. We exchanged pleasantries, but I could see the tension in her eyes. It was almost as if she was waiting for something. I smiled at her, offering a drink, and then I dropped the bomb. "I know about you and Jessica," I said, my voice calm but firm. She froze. Her face drained of color as she stammered. What are you talking about?" I leaned back in my chair, watching her closely. "I saw everything last night. The kiss, the way you two looked at each other. I know you've been seeing her behind my back." Her facade cracked, and she let out a shaky breath. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Sorry," I repeated, shaking my head. "It's not about being sorry. It's about the betrayal, the lies. You've both crossed a line." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "But here's the thing. I'm not going to punish you the way you think. You'll get what you deserve, though." The moment she heard those words, I could see the panic rising in her eyes. She had no idea what I was planning, but she knew she was in deep trouble. I knew I couldn't save my marriage with Jessica, but I could still teach her a lesson. Sarah was about to find out what happens when you cross the wrong person. The next day, I arranged a meeting between Jessica and Sarah, pretending everything was fine. As soon as they entered the room, I showed them the evidence, text messages, pictures, and even recordings of their conversations. Jessica was stunned, her face turning pale as she realized the depth of my knowledge. Sarah's guilt was evident, but she couldn't deny the truth. Jessica turned to me, her voice trembling. How did you know?" I stood tall, finally feeling the power that had been slipping from my fingers for months. "I always knew. I just wanted you to be the one to tell me. But since you didn't, I'll take matters into my own hands." For Sarah, I had already prepared a shocking turn. I had contacted her family, her fiancé, and shared everything. I didn't want to make it personal, but I needed her to understand the consequences of her actions. As for Jessica, I made it clear that I was done. The love I once had for her had evaporated, replaced with a cold, calculated decision. The following weeks were difficult. Jessica tried to salvage our relationship, but the damage was done. She couldn't believe how I had orchestrated the whole thing, how I had turned the tables on her and Sarah. It was the ultimate betrayal reversal. Both women had received what they deserved, not just the heartbreak of losing me, but the shame of knowing they had been exposed in the worst possible way. As for me, I moved on. I wasn't seeking revenge for revenge's sake, but I made sure they knew exactly what it felt like to lose everything, the same way I did. The cheater got what she deserved, and the friend learned the hard way that some lines are never meant to be crossed. In the aftermath of everything, I realized how much I had underestimated myself. The pain and betrayal from Jessica had been overwhelming, but through all of it, I found strength I never knew I had. The weeks that followed weren't easy, but they were necessary for my healing. Jessica kept calling, texting, even showing up at my door, apologizing profusely. She said everything from, "I made a mistake," to "I was lost, I didn't know what I was doing." The typical excuses that cheaters make when they've been caught. But the more she begged for forgiveness, the more I realized how manipulative she had become over the years. It wasn't just the affair. It was the web of lies she'd been weaving around me for so long. She had truly believed I would never find out, that I would remain in the dark forever. I met with her a few times, mainly to close that chapter of my life. Each meeting ended the same way. Me, remaining firm and uninterested in her apologies, and Jessica, defeated, broken. The more I let her speak, the more I felt nothing for her. There was no anger, no love, just emptiness. Sarah, on the other hand, wasn't as persistent. Once her own personal consequences started catching up with her, I didn't hear from her again. Her fiancé had found out everything, and I could see the pain in his eyes whenever I crossed paths with him. The gossip spread through their circle fast, and Sarah was publicly humiliated. While I never intended to ruin her life, the weight of her actions had led her down a path she couldn't escape from. Her reputation was shattered. It was around this time that I realized something profound. Revenge had never been my ultimate goal. It wasn't about making Jessica and Sarah suffer. It was about taking back control of my life, gaining the clarity I needed to move on. I didn't need them to suffer for me to feel better. In fact, seeing them grapple with the fallout of their choices only made me feel sad, not victorious. The more I reflected, the clearer it became. The greatest revenge was not in causing pain, but in embracing freedom. It wasn't about making Jessica pay for her betrayal, but about rediscovering who I was before her. It was about taking back the time, the emotional energy, and the trust one had given to someone who hadn't earned it. I had always been so focused on the idea of us, of we, but now I was learning to focus on me, on my own well-being. As time passed, I focused on building myself back up. I traveled, spent more time with friends and family, and did things that made me happy again. I learned that in life, betrayal could sting, but it didn't define me. It didn't dictate my worth or the future I would create. Months later, I received a letter from Jessica. She apologized again, but this time, it wasn't for reconciliation. She simply wanted me to know she was trying to be better, to fix herself. She admitted she had lost her way and that she was going through therapy. The letter ended with her wishing me the best in life, hoping I would find happiness and peace. There was no begging, no pleading, just acceptance of what had happened and an acknowledgement of her mistakes. It felt like a final chapter to a painful book, one that I had long since closed. As for me, I had already moved on. I had learned that sometimes the greatest form of strength is to simply walk away from what hurts you. Jessica and Sarah had their consequences, and I had mine, healing, growth, and the freedom to live my life without the weight of betrayal. I had faced the darkest moment in my life, but now I could see the light, and I would never again let anyone, especially someone I loved, take that away from me. As the months went on, I continued my journey of self-discovery. I realized that the betrayal was just one chapter in a much larger story. It had been painful, yes, but it also opened my eyes to how much I had been willing to tolerate in my marriage, how I had let my own happiness be dependent on someone else. I took a long, hard look at my past choices and began to understand the subtle ways in which I had been compromised emotionally drained, and in many ways, disconnected from myself. While Jessica had her own path of growth, I chose to fully embrace mine. I invested more time in my passions and hobbies, things I had long neglected. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years. I started volunteering, finding fulfillment in helping others, and building a sense of community that I had missed for so long. It was a world I had never considered before, a world where I was in charge of my happiness, not relying on anyone else's validation. A few months later, I met someone new. It wasn't anything that happened suddenly or dramatically. It was more like a slow-burning connection that developed over time. Her name was Emily, and she was kind, intelligent, and genuinely interested in getting to know the real me, the one who wasn't just defined by the past. Our relationship blossomed naturally, with no games, no lies, and no pretenses. There was a refreshing honesty between us, and I learned to trust again, but this time with a deeper understanding of what I truly needed in a partner. The experience with Jessica and Sarah had taught me many lessons. The biggest one was the importance of boundaries, not just in a romantic relationship, but in all aspects of life. It wasn't about being afraid of getting hurt again. It was about knowing my worth, knowing when to walk away, and never settling for anything less than respect and love. Over time, I realized that the revenge I had sought wasn't in the form of vengeance or punishment. It was in living a life where I wasn't defined by the actions of others. I had learned to move forward without bitterness, to heal without needing to watch them suffer. The true power I had taken back was the power to build a future free from the toxic patterns of the past. And as for Jessica and Sarah, they continued their lives, as I did mine. Jessica, despite her efforts to change, never truly recovered from the fallout of what had happened. She moved to a different city, far from where we had lived together, and from what I heard, she was working through the consequences of her actions. She had to rebuild her own life, and though I no longer cared about the details, I couldn't help but feel a bit of sympathy for her. After all, she was once someone I loved deeply, and that love wasn't just erased by betrayal. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed to fade into the background. The relationship she had with her fiancé never fully recovered, and she seemed to step away from social circles that once supported her. It was a reminder of how much one's actions can affect not only themselves but everyone around them. As for me, I kept moving forward. Life was too short to dwell on the past. Every day was a new opportunity to build a better version of myself, one that didn't rely on anyone's approval but my own. And in that, I found a kind of peace I had never known before. The cheater, Jessica, got what she deserved, not just in terms of losing me, but in realizing that the lies she had built her life on could never provide the happiness she was searching for. And Sarah, her best friend, was left to live with the guilt of betraying someone who had trusted her. But me? I had reclaimed my freedom, my peace, and my ability to trust again, not in others, but in myself. I no longer needed to hold on to the anger or hurt. What had been done was done, and I had risen from it stronger than ever, and that, in the end, was the best form of justice.